Hi guys, Olive here. Here today to recommend you some nonfiction books and fiction books that I think work really well when you pair them up. Before I ever started making YouTube videos, I discovered that reading a fiction book and a nonfiction book that were either on the same topic or covered similar ground, reading them either at the same time or around the same time was a really great way to get more out of both of those books. So for instance, I would sometimes read a classical work of literature, and I would pair that up with a biography of the author who wrote it. So I felt like I was getting to know the author as I was reading their work. I was understanding the story behind that work itself. Or I would sometimes read a work of historical fiction and pair that up with a work of history about the time period or the happenings going on within the work of historical fiction. So I was really able to understand everything better. I found that by doing this, by pairing up a fiction and nonfiction book, I was enriching the overall reading experience of both books, and I was retaining so much more of what I read because I was reinforcing the knowledge I was picking up across two different books. This is also a really great way to get into nonfiction if you don't read nonfiction already. You can pick a novel you really want to read and add on a nonfiction book that will take that novel to another level for you. And this is just a lot of fun. I've had great success doing this over the years. I really enjoy doing it. The only issue is that it can be hard to know before you've read either of the books if they're going to make a good pair. You kind of need to know what the contents inside the book are before you can know what their best match will be. So for that reason, for years now here on my channel, I have been making these types of recommendations videos where I suggest a fiction book and a nonfiction book that you should pair up to get the best results. And in today's video, I have the latest batch. I'll start off by discussing a pairing that includes a very popular novel, to say the least. It's Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmis, the story of how a female scientist ends up hosting a very successful cooking show in the late 1950s to early 1960s. If you haven't read this one yet, or if you're even planning on rereading it before watching the miniseries on Apple TV, then I would highly suggest pairing it up with The Secret History of Home Economics by Danielle Drellinger, a history of the entire home economics field, a field that has been largely looked down upon over the years because of its associations with domestic work, which has long been perceived to be the exclusive domain of women. Reading the nonfiction book, you can really feel how well Elizabeth Zott, who's the main character of Lessons in Chemistry, if she were a real person, you could feel how well she would fit in amongst this group of pioneering women. And many of the problems that Elizabeth Zott comes up against in the novel are discussed within The Secret History of Home Economics, namely sexism. I think these two have perfect chemistry. One matchup that I just have to recommend in this video includes a very new nonfiction book called The Wager by David Grann. This book tells the story of an 18th century shipwreck and how the survivors of said shipwreck ended up marooned on an uninhabited island off the coast of Patagonia. It was a dire situation, and one that put on display essentially every negative human characteristic that can emerge when survival is on the line. And if that all sounds familiar, it's because it's essentially the plot of the classic novel Lord of the Flies by William Golding. If you weren't forced to read this one in school, like I was, then I'll let you know that it's about a group of schoolboys who become stranded on an island after a plane crash, and their baser instincts take over after they try and fail to create their own society. And as I was reading The Wager, it felt like William Golding must have consulted it for research, except William Golding published Lord of the Flies back in 1954, almost 70 years before The Wager hit shelves. But these two are so similar, they belong together. The two books in my next pairing have almost the exact same theme running through both of them, even though they couldn't be more different in terms of the styles of books they are. But the fiction book in this pairing is called Evie Drake Starts Over by Lydia Holmes, a romance book that I absolutely loved. It stars a woman named Evie Drake, and right when we meet her, she has just become widowed very unexpectedly. Her husband died in a tragic accident, but no one in her orbit knows that right before her husband died, she was actually planning on leaving him. So this leaves her with a lot of conflicted feelings. When people express their sympathies, she's not sure if she deserves them because she didn't even really want to be with him anymore. All of that conflicted emotion is a very big part of the emotional journey she goes on throughout this novel. And so when I picked up a memoir called All of This by Rebecca Wolf, which was written by a woman who decided to stand by her husband following his cancer diagnosis, even though both of them, at that point, knew that the marriage was over. I couldn't help but think of Evie Drake. I've seen both of these books be referred to as grief and relief because there's sadness and loss in these situations. Not only is the marriage over, but the person is gone. It's tragic. And then at the exact same time, there's also a feeling of relief and freedom because these women are no longer being tied down in marriages that were no longer serving them. It's such a specific thing to happen to someone that I was just flabbergasted that I stumbled into both a novel and a memoir that discuss such similar situations. And so I think reading these at the same time or around the same time would really help you put yourself in the shoes of both Evie and Rebecca. But speaking of loss, my next pairing includes a novel that I recently read and absolutely fell in love with. It's called The Collected Regrets of Clover by Mickey Brammer, and it's essentially a coming-of-age story, even though our main character is in her mid-30s. Clover works as a death doula. She helps people who are at the end of their lives have a smooth passage to the other side. But she herself is rather isolated. She has a really hard time connecting with other people, which over the course of the novel is something that she realizes that she would regret if she were at the end of her own life. And so she uses the regrets of her dying clients, all of their wisdom, to help guide her into a more fulfilled life. Because of the work that Clover does, I would highly suggest reading this fantastic novel alongside Death is But a Dream by Christopher Kerr or Being Mortal by Atul Gawande, or maybe even both. Death is But a Dream was written by a hospice doctor who discusses what happens in the brain at the end of life, and the entire book is full of highly emotional and touching anecdotes. The book kind of felt like a continuation of the conversation begun in Being Mortal, which just so happens to be one of my all-time favorite nonfiction books. In my eyes, it is a life-changing nonfiction book because it confronts the Western attitude toward death and the specifically American tendency to fight off death with a take-no-prisoners mentality, even when that approach comes at the cost of the well-being of the patient. Reading either of these alongside The Collected Regrets of Clover, it's going to bring the tears. I'm not going to lie to you about it. However, I do think it'll help you connect more deeply with the main character, and you can see just how valuable the work she does is. And then finally, my last pairing recommendation in this video is another one that just kind of snuck up on me, because recently I read a nonfiction book called How Magicians Think by Joshua Jay, which is a surprisingly fantastic essay collection full of mini essays on the experience of being a professional magician and illusionist, and all the care and artistry that goes into creating great tricks and a fun experience for the audience. Joshua Jay has been a magician since he was a child. It's really the only thing he's ever done. He cares about it so deeply. He is so passionate about it. I thought that reading this nonfiction book would just be a fun kind of throwaway nonfiction pick, but I was blown away by how good this was. It was so good, in fact, that not only did it make me develop a new appreciation for all the professional magicians out there, but it also made me look back at a novel I read a while ago with all new eyes. Around this time last year, I read a novel called Acts of Violet by Margarita Montemor, and the titular character, Violet, is a professional magician who actually disappeared during one of her performances 10 years before the events of this novel, and she was never heard from again. And so 10 years following this, a true crime podcast starts to investigate, which then drags Violet's sister back into the trauma of it all. In the novel, we do get flashback scenes 2 times before Violet disappeared, so we get to know her a little bit, and we get to see just how serious she was about crafting her act. And I'll be honest with you, part of the problem that I had with Acts of Violet when I first read it is that Violet's a pretty prickly character. She is challenging to love. But reading How Magicians Think made me mentally go back to this novel and back to the character of Violet and appreciate the care she took in putting on a good show. And also, it made me appreciate what she would have been up against as a woman in an extremely male-dominated industry. I don't think I realized how male-dominated this industry was before reading Joshua Jay's book. So not only do I think these make a good pair, I think How Magicians Think is essential reading if you want to read Acts of Violet, because it'll help you understand this hugely important character. I mean, she's in the title of the book. It'll help you understand her on a level that I don't think you'll be able to without Joshua Jay's book. Now, I don't think his tricks extend to the ending of Acts of Violet. I am still not the biggest fan of how that novel ended, but Joshua Jay's magic works on the rest of it. So those were 5 more fiction and nonfiction matchups that I absolutely recommend you read either side by side or at the very least closely together in time. I think you'll have good results with these. And if you want even more recommendations like the ones in this video, like I said, I've been making these types of videos for years now, and I've made a playlist of all the ones I've done up to this point that I'll link for you in the description box below and up in the cards. All the books that I did mention today will be linked for you in the description box below for your clicking convenience, and at the bottom of that exact same description box, you'll also see links to everywhere you can find me around the internets. Goodreads, Instagram, the Story Graph, all the places I'm the most active, in case you want to keep up with what I'm reading and what I'm doing right now. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.